What would you do if you saw injustice unfold right before your eyes? Would you step forward or look away? At a quiet shopping plaza in Atlanta, a simple shopping trip takes a brutal turn when Miriam Caldwell, a retired teacher, dares to challenge authority. A single act of defiance sets off a chain reaction, one that will shake the system to its core. Before we dive in, let us know, what time are you listening to this, and where are you? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. The morning air in Atlanta carried a crisp autumn chill, the kind that hinted at the season's slow descent into winter. The streets were alive with the hum of a city waking up. Coffee shops buzzing with early risers, traffic crawling through the avenues, and pedestrians bundled up against the morning breeze. At Clementine's Cafe, a small, warm corner tucked away from the busy streets, Miriam Caldwell sat in her usual seat by the window. The cafe had become her second home over the years, a place where the scent of roasted beans and baked pastries greeted her every morning, where she exchanged pleasantries with familiar faces, and where she could momentarily set aside the weight of the world. She wrapped her fingers around a ceramic mug, letting the warmth seep into her palms as she watched the steam curl upwards. She had always been a morning person, someone who cherished these quiet moments before the day's unpredictability set in. A folded newspaper lay on the table in front of her, but she hadn't turned the page in a while. Instead, she found herself staring out the window, lost in thought. At 73, Miriam had lived through enough history to know that change didn't come easily. She had marched in protest as a young woman, felt the sting of tear gas in the air, and stood shoulder to shoulder with those who believed in justice. Time had softened the sharp edges of those memories, but it had never dulled their significance. Her phone buzzed against the table, pulling her back to the present. She glanced at the screen. Elias Caldwell. "Morning, sweetheart," she greeted, pressing the phone to her ear. "Morning, Ma," came Elias's familiar voice, steady as ever. There was something reassuring about the way he spoke. Calm, measured, always in control. "Busy?" she asked, already knowing the answer. "Always." She could hear the rustling of papers in the background, the faint hum of office chatter. "But I wanted to check in. You doing okay?" Miriam smiled. Her son had a habit of calling at random hours, checking up on her between his demanding cases. He was a federal prosecutor, constantly tangled in legal battles that sought to hold the powerful accountable. It was work that took its toll, but Elias had never been one to back down. "I'm fine, just having my coffee," she assured him. "Planning to head to Brookhaven Plaza later. Want to pick up something for Ava's birthday." Elias let out a short chuckle. "You know she's expecting something extravagant. She's 5. A dress and some sparkly shoes will make her feel like a queen." "Well, you always know best," Elias said. Then after a pause, "Call me if you need anything, okay?" Miriam didn't miss the subtle concern in his tone. "I always do," she replied. After ending the call, she finished her coffee, left a few bills on the table, and stepped out onto the bustling sidewalk. Brookhaven Plaza was already lively by the time Miriam arrived. Families weaved through the walkways, shoppers carried bags filled with weekend purchases, and children tugged at their parents' hands, eager for a trip to the toy store. The upscale shopping center had long been a staple of Atlanta's commercial district, a place where people from all walks of life crossed paths. She made her way to Little Wonders, a children's boutique filled with delicate dresses and tiny shoes that sparkled under the store's warm lighting. As she browsed through the racks, a voice caught her attention. "I didn't steal anything." The voice was young, high-pitched with fear. Miriam turned her head toward the counter, where a boy, no older than 12, stood frozen under the accusatory glare of the cashier. Jalen Brooks. He looked small under the fluorescent lights, his hands balled into fists at his sides. The cashier, a woman in her 40s with a sharp gaze, narrowed her eyes. "Then open your bag," she demanded. Jalen's face was pale, his breath uneven. "I swear I didn't take anything." Miriam's heart tightened. She had seen this scene play out too many times before. A black boy, a suspicious store employee, an assumption of guilt before innocence. She stepped forward. "Is there a reason you're treating him like a criminal?" The cashier glanced at her but didn't waver. "A customer said they saw him pocket something. Store policy says we have the right to check." "Store policy also says you need proof before you accuse a child of stealing," Miriam countered, her voice calm but firm. The tension in the store thickened. Other customers had begun to pause, watching the exchange unfold. "I don't need a lecture," the cashier snapped. "Either he opens his bag or I call security." Jalen looked at Miriam, his eyes wide with uncertainty. "Go ahead," Miriam said, stepping in front of the boy. "Call them." The cashier's lips pressed into a thin line before she picked up the store phone and dialed. Moments later, the front door swung open, and a man in uniform strode inside. Officer Travis Denton. Miriam didn't have to know him personally to recognize the type. Tall, broad-shouldered, a badge polished to perfection, and an expression that told her he wasn't here to de-escalate anything. "What's the problem here?" Denton's voice carried authority, though there was an edge of impatience beneath it. The cashier pointed at Jalen. "Suspected shoplifting." Denton's gaze landed on the boy for a fleeting second before shifting to Miriam. His expression changed, hardening, growing cold. "And you?" "I was just making sure no one's accused unfairly," Miriam said, holding his stare. Denton's jaw tightened. "Step aside, ma'am. Let me handle this." Miriam didn't move. "The boy hasn't done anything wrong." Denton exhaled sharply, already irritated. "You can leave now." Miriam squared her shoulders. "Not until you hear him out." A flicker of something, annoyance, maybe even recognition, crossed Denton's face. He took a step closer, his presence looming over her. "I'm not going to ask you again." Miriam felt the weight of the moment pressing down. The store had gone silent, all eyes on them. Even Jalen, who had been trembling just moments ago, looked at her with something like hope. She had a choice. She could walk away, let this unfold as it always did, or she could stand her ground. She took a breath, steadying herself. "Why should I leave?" she asked, her voice calm but unwavering. "This boy hasn't done anything wrong." Denton exhaled sharply, the muscle in his jaw twitching. He took a step closer, his presence looming over her. "I don't have time for this," he muttered, his voice clipped with irritation. "Step aside and let me do my job." But Miriam didn't step aside. She could feel her heart pounding, but it wasn't from fear. It was from something deeper, something ingrained in her since she was young. The memories came back like echoes, unbidden but clear, marching through the streets, linking arms with strangers who had become brothers and sisters in the fight for justice. She had felt the same pressure back then, standing before police officers who saw her as a nuisance rather than a citizen. She wasn't about to let history repeat itself without resistance. "If your job is to accuse a child without cause," she said, "then maybe you should reconsider it." A murmur spread through the crowd that had gathered. The tension thickened, and the cashier hesitated. Her fingers twitched as if reconsidering whether she had been too quick to judge. Even Jalen, who had been trembling just moments ago, lifted his chin slightly, as if drawing strength from Miriam's presence. But Denton wasn't interested in reason. "I'm not going to ask again," he warned. "Either you leave, or I'll have to charge you with disturbing the peace." Miriam's shoulders squared. "Go ahead." Denton's nostrils flared, his patience wearing thin. He was used to compliance, not defiance, especially from someone like her. The elderly, the weak, the ones who usually backed down when authority loomed over them. But Miriam was neither weak nor willing to back down. Just then, another voice cut through the heavy air. "Officer Denton, let's not escalate this." A woman stepped forward from behind the counter. Tasha Morgan, a store employee who had been watching from the sidelines. She was younger, maybe in her late 30s, her dark curls pulled into a bun. Her expression was cautious, but her voice was steady. Miriam recognized her. She had seen her working at the store before, always polite, always quick to offer help when she visited. Denton turned to Tasha, eyes narrowing. "And who the hell are you?" Tasha crossed her arms. "Someone who actually works here," she said, "and I can tell you that this isn't the first time you've made a scene like this." A ripple of murmurs went through the crowd again. Denton's face darkened, his fingers flexing at his sides. "I'm doing my job," he said through clenched teeth. "No," Tasha said, her voice low but sharp. "You're flexing your authority where it isn't needed." Denton's jaw clenched. "You better watch yourself." Tasha met his gaze, unwavering. "Or what?" The tension had reached a boiling point. Denton's shoulders tightened, his body rigid with restrained anger. Miriam could see it happening before it did. Denton didn't like being challenged. He didn't like the eyes on him, the murmurs questioning his authority, and then it happened. He shoved Miriam. The force wasn't violent, but it was enough to make her stumble back. Enough to draw a collective gasp from the watching crowd. Enough to send a clear message. He wasn't just talking. And before she could stop herself, Miriam reacted. Her hand shot up. A sharp slap cracked through the store. The crowd fell into stunned silence. Even Denton's expression flickered, surprise then something darker. Miriam's palms stung, but she kept her chin lifted, her gaze locked onto Denton's. She had lived too long, seen too much to stand by and let men like him decide what justice looked like. Denton's face darkened. He took a step forward, his fist clenched. The sound of the slap still lingered in the air, reverberating like the last note of an unfinished song. For a moment, everything in the store froze, a moment so fragile that even the fluorescent lights above seemed to hum louder. Miriam stood unmoving, her breath steady despite the rush of adrenaline coursing through her veins. Across from her, Officer Travis Denton stared, his face twisted in stunned disbelief, his jaw clenched so tightly that the tendons in his neck bulged. The world tilted. Then, like a dam breaking, his rage erupted. With no hesitation, Denton's fist shot forward. The blow landed hard against Miriam's cheekbone, the force knocking her off balance. Her body crumpled, hitting the tile floor with a sickening thud. Gasps erupted from the growing crowd. Someone screamed. For a split second, everything was still. Then a voice, small, trembling, but sharp enough to pierce the silence. "No!" Jalen. The 12-year-old stood frozen, his hands clenched into fists, his whole body trembling as he watched the woman who had stood up for him, lying motionless on the floor. His chest rose and fell erratically, panic taking hold. On the far side of the room, Tasha Morgan broke through her shock, her instincts kicking in. She moved toward Miriam, but Denton took a step back, his hand flashing to his hip. The crowd recoiled, his fingers wrapped around the grip of his holstered firearm, his stance shifting into that of a man ready to escalate. His voice when he spoke was low, sharp, deadly. "Nobody moves!" The authority in his tone sent a ripple of fear through the onlookers. The badge on his chest gleamed under the harsh store lights, an emblem of power that had shielded him for too long. Miriam lay still, her cheek pulsing with sharp, stinging pain. The coldness of the tile pressed against her palms as she tried to push herself up. Her vision blurred at the edges, but she was still aware. Aware of the silence, aware of the fear, aware that she had been in this position before. Decades ago, in a different fight. But this wasn't the 1960s, and this time, she wasn't alone. Across the store, Jalen's small frame trembled, his eyes darting around, searching for someone to stop this. Tasha's breathing was heavy, her arms rigid at her sides as she locked eyes with Denton. There was fire in her voice when she spoke. "You've lost your damn mind." Denton's eyes flicked toward her, but his focus remained on the gathering crowd. More customers had stopped to watch, some frozen in disbelief, others fumbling with their phones, unsure if they should record, if they should intervene. A man near the back took a cautious step toward the door, then another. Someone was going to get help, but Denton wasn't done yet. His grip on his gun tightened. His posture remained rigid, his breathing slow, controlled. He wanted to be feared, and for years he had been. "You think I won't use it?" Denton growled. The weight of his threat hung in the air. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. A flicker of uncertainty passed across Denton's face. Then suddenly, the front doors of the store flew open. The atmosphere shifted. A presence entered the space, cutting through the tension like a blade through fabric. Elias Caldwell. He strode in with purpose, his navy suit crisp against the chaos, his controlled steps in stark contrast to the fear in the room. His eyes swept over the scene, taking in everything within seconds. His mother on the ground, Denton with his hand on his gun, the sheer weight of silence pressing against the room like a held breath. And then his expression changed. The cool, collected exterior that he carried so well, the one he had perfected in courtrooms, in negotiations, in battles where words were his weapons, shifted into something far colder. a fury that only a son could feel. He walked past the rows of frozen customers, past Jalen, whose wide eyes darted toward him in silent plea. He crossed the store in long, measured strides and knelt beside Miriam, his movements smooth, controlled. He reached for her, his voice lower now, quieter but laced with barely restrained rage. "Mom?" She let out a slow breath, feeling the steadying warmth of his hand. "I'm fine." She wasn't fine, but she refused to let this be about pain. Elias helped her sit up, his fingers momentarily brushing against the forming bruise on her face. He inhaled sharply through his nose. Then slowly he stood. He turned. And for the first time that night, Denton faltered. Elias adjusted his sleeves, brushing off an invisible speck of dust. Then he stepped forward. Closing the space, Denton stood taller, his grip still firm on his holster, but his stance no longer as sure. Recognition flickered between them. Elias tilted his head slightly. "You know who I am." Denton didn't respond, but Miriam saw it, that shift in Denton's expression, the way his shoulders tightened, the way his fingers flexed just slightly. Yes, he knew Elias, and Elias knew him. The weight in the air grew heavier. Elias took another slow step forward, forcing Denton to either hold his ground or retreat. His voice, when he spoke again, was like ice. "You just hit my mother." Silence. A nerve in Denton's jaw twitched. His fingers twitched, too, his grip on the holster adjusting, reconsidering. Miriam watched her son, his calm, dangerous resolve. She had seen this look before, in his father. In the quiet, calculated way men like him fought battles not with fists, but with power, with presence, with the undeniable weight of truth. Elias didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to, but the room felt smaller. The walls seemed to close in. And Denton? He wasn't sure if he had the upper hand anymore. Denton's stance was rigid, his shoulders squared, his hands still hovering near his holster. But there was something different in his eyes. Hesitation. It was brief, fleeting, but Elias caught it. He took a slow step forward, his expression unreadable. "You know who I am, don't you?" His voice was even, steady, carrying the weight of unspoken history. Denton's jaw tightened. "You think I care?" "Oh, you care," Elias said, his gaze locked onto Denton's. "You remember the last time we crossed paths?" Miriam, still on the ground, sucked in a sharp breath. There was history between them. Denton didn't answer, but his fingers twitched ever so slightly at his side. Elias continued, his voice cutting through the tense air. "It was 4 years ago. Another excessive force case. A black man left with broken ribs and a shattered eye socket because you didn't like the way he talked back to you. That man was going to testify against you, but the case was dropped before it ever made it to trial." "And you know why?" Denton's lips pressed into a thin line. "Because there wasn't enough evidence," Elias answered for him. His voice was softer now, more measured. "The body cam footage mysteriously disappeared. Witnesses changed their stories. And just like that, you walked away." Murmurs spread through the store. The weight of Elias's words settled over the crowd, a slow realization creeping into their expressions. Miriam's heart pounded. This wasn't just about tonight. This was bigger. Elias turned his attention to Tasha, who had been standing frozen beside the counter. "Check the security cameras," he said, his voice firm but calm. Tasha hesitated, glancing toward the mounted cameras along the ceiling. Then, without a word, she rushed to the back office. A moment later, she returned, her face pale. "They're off," she said quietly. "They were turned off earlier tonight." A new ripple of unease moved through the crowd. Elias turned back to Denton. "You knew there wouldn't be evidence." Denton let out a slow exhale, but the confidence in his posture remained. "You don't have anything on me." Elias tilted his head slightly, watching him. "That's what you thought last time, too." Miriam shifted, trying to sit up. Elias immediately knelt beside her. His eyes softened, his hands gentle as he helped her to a sitting position. "Mom," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "Are you okay?" Miriam winced but gave him a small nod. "I'll be fine." She reached up, her fingers brushing his arm. "Don't let your anger decide this for you." Elias inhaled sharply. He had spent years watching injustice slip through the cracks. He had seen people like Denton walk free because the system protected them. And now his mother was on the floor, bruised and hurt, because of this man. A part of him wanted to throw the law aside, to demand justice here and now. But he knew better. He had two choices. If he tried to take Denton down right now, it could spiral out of control. Other officers would protect one of their own. His mother, Jalen, the people watching, someone else could get hurt, or he could play the long game. Make sure Denton didn't just lose tonight, but for good. Elias clenched his jaw. He stood, helping his mother to her feet. Then he turned back to Denton. "You've crossed the line," he said, his voice cool and sharp. "And I'm going to make sure you answer for it." Denton let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. But there was something behind his eyes, a flicker of doubt, of fear. The front doors burst open again. Mall security stormed inside, followed closely by two uniformed police officers from Midtown Precinct. The moment they saw the scene, the shaken crowd, the bruised woman, the tension in the air, they hesitated. Elias didn't waste time. He turned to the senior officer, his voice commanding. "I want him in cuffs. Now." A long silence stretched between them. The officers exchanged glances, their hesitation visible. This was one of their own. But there were too many eyes on them now. Too many witnesses. And Elias Caldwell wasn't just any man. He was a federal prosecutor, and he knew exactly how to make sure this wouldn't go away. The senior officer took a breath. Then finally he nodded. The tension in Denton's body shifted, his hands curling into fists. "Turn around," the officer ordered. Denton was the one caught in a moment of helplessness. He stood still for a long second, his jaw clenching. Then slowly he turned, placing his hands behind his back. The sound of the handcuffs clicking shut echoed through the silent store. No one spoke. No one moved. And just like that, the power had shifted. The flashing red and blue lights painted the night in sharp, jarring streaks as the police car carrying Travis Denton pulled into the Midtown Precinct. The building was an imposing structure of brick and steel, its exterior washed in the glow of streetlights. Inside, the air was thick with the hum of voices, the clatter of keyboards, and the occasional barked order from a tired officer at his desk. Elias Caldwell stepped out of his car, his shoulders squared, his mind already calculating his next move. Cynthia Ward, his colleague from the Department of Justice, walked beside him, her heels clicking against the pavement. "We need to make sure they don't sweep this under the rug," she muttered. "They won't," Elias said, but he wasn't entirely sure. Inside, Denton was led through the station, still in his uniform, his badge now a hollow symbol hanging from his chest. He walked with the same arrogant stride, as if the handcuffs around his wrists were just a minor inconvenience. Miriam had been right about one thing. Denton wasn't afraid. Not yet. As Elias entered the station, his mother's absence weighed on him. She had insisted on going to the hospital for a brief checkup but had refused to stay. He knew she was still hurting, but she had made it clear. She wanted to see this through. At the far end of the room, Tasha Morgan was already giving her statement to an officer, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She looked shaken but determined. Elias turned his attention back to Denton, who was now seated in an interrogation room. Through the one-way mirror, Elias studied him, leaning back in his chair, arms crossed, not a trace of regret on his face. Elias pushed open the door. Denton barely glanced at him. "Prosecutor Caldwell," Denton said, his voice laced with mockery. "Come to lecture me about justice?" Elias took a seat across from him, setting a folder down on the metal table. He didn't open it. He didn't need to. "You assaulted a civilian," Elias said, his tone flat. "She put her hands on me first," Denton shot back, his mouth twisting into something like a smirk. "You're a trained officer," Elias countered. "She's 73. Denton exhaled sharply and leaned forward. "Caldwell, let's not pretend this is anything new. I've been on this force for over 15 years. I've seen how these cases play out. You make your little scene, stir up the public, and in the end," he shrugged, "it gets buried. The system protects its own." Elias felt his fingers curl into fists under the table, but his mother's voice echoed in his mind. "Don't let anger guide your decisions." Instead, he smiled, slow and calculated. "Funny thing about systems," he said, "they only work until someone figures out how to break them." Denton chuckled, shaking his head. You think you're the first to come after me? No, Elias admitted, but I'll be the last. A knock on the door interrupted them. An officer in a crisp Navy uniform stepped in, his expression unreadable. Caldwell, the man said, there's someone here to see you. Elias glanced at Cynthia before rising to his feet. Something about the officer's tone made his stomach tighten. He followed the officer down the hallway, through a side door, into a quieter part of the precinct. Inside a dimly lit office, a man in his late 50s stood waiting. Elias recognized him immediately, Captain Raymond Holt, a high-ranking official from the Atlanta Police Department. Holt gestured toward a chair. Sit, he said simply. Elias didn't move. I assume you're here to tell me why this case is about to disappear. Holt let out a slow breath. I'm here to offer a resolution. Is that what we're calling it? Elias asked, his voice sharp. Holt sat on the edge of the desk, folding his arms. Look, Caldwell, I get it. You're doing your job. You want justice. But you and I both know how these things go. Enlighten me. Holt studied him for a moment. We suspend Denton. No charges, no trial. He's off the force, no pension, no benefits. He disappears. You walk away knowing he won't wear a badge again. Elias let the words sink in. This was how it always happened. The quiet deals, the closed doors, the negotiations that allowed people like Denton to slip through the cracks. Elias exhaled slowly. Then he shook his head. No. Holt's expression didn't change. Be smart, Caldwell. If you push for a trial, the department fights back. Do you really think we're going to let one of our own go down that easily? Elias took a step closer. You don't get it, do you? He said. This isn't about Denton anymore. This is about every case like his. The ones that got covered up, the ones that never made it to court. If I take your deal, it happens again next year, and the year after that. Holt was quiet for a long moment. Then finally he sighed. Then you're in for a war, he warned. Elias didn't flinch. I've been fighting one my whole life. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the office, leaving Holt in the dim light behind him. There would be no deals. Not this time. The air outside Midtown Precinct was thick with anticipation. The street in front of the station was no longer just a sidewalk. It had transformed into a battlefield of voices, flashing cameras, and hurried reporters dictating updates into their microphones. Protesters lined the curb, their signs held high with messages demanding justice. Their faces a mix of anger, exhaustion, and unwavering determination. Some chanted, others simply watched, waiting for the moment when the tides would shift. At the center of it all, Elias Caldwell stood tall, flanked by Cynthia Ward and his mother, Miriam Caldwell. The weight of the moment pressed against his chest, but his face remained calm, composed. Miriam, despite the bruising on her cheek, refused to let pain dictate her stance. She had spent her life teaching children the power of standing up for themselves, and today she was living that lesson. She stood beside her son, her back straight, her eyes unwavering as she gazed across the sea of onlookers. From the edge of the crowd, Tasha Morgan stood clutching her phone, her fingers gripping it so tightly her knuckles turned white. She had played her part already. She had come forward. She had taken the risk. But the final act of justice was still unwritten. Elias took a deep breath, then stepped forward, facing the row of microphones set up in front of him. He could feel the cameras zooming in, the city watching, waiting. He cleared his throat, his voice strong and unwavering. This is not just about my mother, Elias began. This is about a system that has protected officers like Travis Denton for too long. For years, men like him have acted with impunity, knowing that the system would shield them. That ends today. A flurry of voices erupted. Mr. Caldwell, are you calling for a formal investigation? Do you believe the department is trying to cover this up? Are you pressing charges against Officer Denton? Before Elias could respond, a sharp voice sliced through the noise. We won't be entertaining baseless accusations. The crowd parted slightly as a man in a tailored Navy suit strode forward, exuding an air of confidence so thick it was suffocating. Charles Lanford, Denton's high-profile defense attorney, stepped up beside the officers at the precinct entrance. He adjusted his tie, a smug smirk pulling at the corners of his mouth. He was used to being in control. My client, Officer Travis Denton, was simply doing his job, Lanford began smoothly. He was assaulted first, and he reacted accordingly. We will not allow this to be twisted into something it is not. A murmur of disbelief rippled through the crowd. Elias felt his jaw tighten, but it was his mother's reaction that caught his attention. Miriam's hands, normally so still, had curled into tight fists at her side, but she didn't speak. Not yet. Lanford continued, pacing slightly as he spoke. In fact, we have evidence that shows Mrs. Caldwell initiated physical contact first. Officer Denton was well within his rights to defend himself. Gasps spread through the crowd. Some reporters looked genuinely stunned. Others merely scribbled furiously in their notepads, ready to spin this into the next headline. Elias narrowed his eyes. He had expected this, but expecting it didn't make it any less infuriating. Lanford turned toward the cameras, smoothing his suit jacket. We have witnesses who will confirm that Officer Denton was provoked. The narrative being pushed here is nothing more than an emotional spectacle designed to... That's a lie, the voice came from the crowd, a sharp, clear voice that cut through the murmurs. All heads turned as Tasha Morgan stepped forward. Lanford raised an eyebrow, his confidence flickering slightly. I'm sorry, who are you? Tasha didn't look at him. She looked at Elias, and in that moment, he knew. She had something. Tasha reached into her pocket, pulled out her phone, and turned the screen toward the cameras. I backed up the security footage before the cameras were wiped. The crowd erupted. Gasps, hurried whispers, reporters scrambling to reposition their cameras. Lanford's smirk faltered. Elias seized the moment. This footage, he said, his voice carrying over the chaos, shows exactly what happened. Officer Denton attacked an unarmed elderly woman. He was not provoked. He was not in danger. He abused his authority, and now he will be held accountable. The weight of his statement pressed down on the entire scene, and then Cynthia Ward stepped forward. As a representative of the Department of Justice, and she announced, her voice firm, I am formally requesting an immediate internal review of Officer Denton's past cases. Additionally, the Atlanta District Attorney's Office will be receiving all evidence related to this incident for formal prosecution. The words hit like a shockwave. Lanford's expression tightened. He knew this wasn't just about one case anymore. If Denton's past was dredged up, others would fall with him. This is outrageous, Lanford snapped, trying to regain control. My client has a right to due process. Elias cut him off. And he'll get it, he said coldly, in a court of law. The crowd roared with renewed energy. The cameras flashed. There was no more spinning this. Lanford muttered something under his breath and turned, storming back into the precinct. But inside, Travis Denton had been watching through a window, and he felt something cold settle in his chest, a fear he had never known before. For years, he had wielded power without consequence. He had worn his badge like a shield, knowing it would protect him from the very laws he had sworn to uphold. But now he was the one being hunted. The courtroom was silent, except for the rhythmic ticking of the clock mounted on the wall. The trial of Travis Denton had become the center of national attention, a case that had reignited debates about police brutality, systemic corruption, and accountability. Miriam sat beside Elias, her hands folded neatly in her lap, though the tight grip of her fingers against the fabric of her skirt betrayed the tension she felt. Across the courtroom, Denton sat stiffly in his chair, his face unreadable. He had traded his uniform for a dark suit, but nothing could disguise the weight pressing down on him. The judge entered and the courtroom stood. As the proceedings began, Denton's lawyer, Charles Lanford, wasted no time in trying to control the narrative. He stood buttoning his jacket with a smooth motion before addressing the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice even and persuasive. What we have here is not a case of police misconduct, but a case of overreaction fueled by emotion, not facts. My client, Officer Denton, was performing his duty, controlling a tense situation, and unfortunately, Mrs. Caldwell, in a moment of passion, laid hands on him first. Miriam's jaw tightened, but she didn't flinch. Lanford continued, pacing before the jury. Let's be clear. An officer is trained to respond to physical aggression. Officer Denton reacted accordingly. This is not about race, not about bias. This is about maintaining order. Elias exhaled slowly through his nose. They were spinning the story, just as expected. Then it was his turn. Elias stood, straightened his tie, and walked toward the jury with slow, deliberate steps. "My mother," he began, his voice steady, "is 73 years old." The weight of his words lingered. She has dedicated her life to education, to teaching children that justice is more than just a word. It's an action. And yet, on that day in Brookhaven Plaza, she was treated as a threat. She was assaulted. And then when she refused to back down, she was struck down. Not because she was a danger, but because she dared to challenge power. Lanford made a motion to object, but Elias raised a hand. "You want facts? Let's talk about facts." He nodded toward the screen at the front of the courtroom. "Roll the video." A hush settled over the room as Tasha's recovered footage played. The grainy security camera footage captured everything. The argument, the push, Denton's clenched fist slamming into Miriam's face. There was no sign of her being aggressive, no provocation, no threat, just raw abuse of power. When the video ended, the silence was deafening. Elias turned back to the jury. "Now tell me, was that self-defense?" He let the question hang in the air before stepping back to his seat. The twist came not from the video itself, but from what followed. Denton turned slightly in his chair, his gaze flicking toward the row of uniformed officers sitting in the audience. These were his colleagues, the ones who had stood by him through other questionable incidents. But this time, they didn't meet his gaze. There was no nod of reassurance, no quiet exchange of loyalty. They were silent. One officer even shifted uncomfortably in his seat, as if suddenly realizing the weight of the system they had been complicit in protecting. Denton had been abandoned, his hands clenched against his lap. He knew then, he wasn't getting out of this. When the jury returned with their verdict, the room was deathly still. The foreman stood, clearing his throat. "On the charge of assault with intent to cause bodily harm, we find the defendant guilty." A collective exhale swept through the courtroom. Denton's face remained rigid, but his knuckles turned white as he gripped the edge of the table. The judge's voice rang out. "Travis Denton, you are hereby stripped of your position as an officer of the law. You will serve time in accordance with the sentencing guidelines for excessive force under color of authority." The gavel struck. It was over. A quiet murmur rippled through the room, some nodding solemnly, others shaking their heads in disbelief. Miriam reached for Elias's hand, squeezing it tightly. They had won, but she knew. This wasn't just about Denton. This was about something bigger. The hum of the city felt different now. The trial was over, the verdict had been delivered, and Travis Denton was now a prisoner in the very system he had once believed untouchable. His sentencing was still weeks away, but the damage was done. His career was over, his reputation beyond repair. Miriam sat in her living room, the afternoon sunlight casting soft shadows against the wooden floors. It had been days since the trial ended, but the calls hadn't stopped. Reporters wanting interviews, activists wanting her voice in their movement. She had politely declined most of them. She hadn't stood up to Denton that day to become a symbol. She had done it because it was the right thing to do. But as she looked at the stack of letters and emails that kept arriving, she couldn't ignore what was happening. Her story had spread beyond Atlanta, beyond the courtroom. People had been watching, listening, and something had changed. Across town, Elias and Cynthia Ward sat in a conference room at the Department of Justice, papers spread across the table. "This isn't just about Denton," Cynthia said, tapping the top page of a proposal. "If we want real change, we need to hit the system that allowed him to exist in the first place." Elias nodded, scanning the draft in front of him. A proposal for new limits on police use of force, mandatory reviews of violent offenses, and independent oversight for internal investigations. "This is going to take time," he admitted. Cynthia smirked. "Good thing we're not in the habit of giving up." Elias exhaled, rubbing his temple. His mother had been right. This wasn't the end. It was just another step in a much longer fight. Meanwhile, inside a dimly lit jail cell, Denton sat on the edge of a metal cot, staring at the cracked concrete wall. He had always assumed that if something like this ever happened, his fellow officers would stand by him. But after the trial, after the video, they had all disappeared. Even the ones who had defended him at first had grown silent. Now they only whispered when he walked past. The realization came in slow, painful waves. He wasn't a hero to them anymore. He wasn't even one of them. The guards tossed him a few letters through the slot in the door. He expected hate mail, threats, maybe the occasional message of support from some stranger who still saw him as the victim. But as he flipped through them, one letter stood out. It was from Miriam Caldwell. He hesitated, staring at her name written in neat cursive letters. After a long moment, he tore the envelope open. Inside was a short note, written in calm, deliberate handwriting. Mr. Denton, I don't hate you. I don't forgive you either. Forgiveness is something you have to earn, not something I can give. But I will tell you this. You have a choice. You can sit in that cell and blame the world for what happened. Or you can take this time to ask yourself who you really are and who you want to be when you walk out of there. I don't believe people are born cruel. I believe they choose it. So the question is, who will you choose to be now? Miriam Caldwell Denton read the letter twice, then a third time. He wanted to scoff, to crumple it up, to shrug it off the way he always had when people like her preached about change. But he didn't. Instead, he sat there staring at the letter for a long time. Back in the city, life went on. Tasha Morgan returned to work at Brookhaven Plaza, though now she walked with a little more confidence. She didn't let things slide the way she used to. She spoke up when she saw something wrong. Jalen Brooks no longer feared walking into a store alone. He knew now that there were people who would stand up for him, even when he couldn't stand up for himself. And Miriam? She went back to Clementine's cafe, settling into her usual seat by the window, wrapping her fingers around a warm mug of coffee. She had no plans of changing the world. She wasn't a politician, an activist, or a leader of movements. But she was someone who had refused to stay silent, and sometimes that was enough to start something bigger. As she sat there watching people pass by outside, a man approached her table hesitantly. He looked to be in his late 30s, wearing a pressed shirt and holding a newspaper folded under his arm. "Excuse me," he said, his voice uncertain. "Are you Miriam Caldwell?" She lifted her gaze, offering him a small nod. "I am." He let out a nervous chuckle, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "I just wanted to say, what you did, standing up to that officer, I saw it, and it made me realize I need to do more. I've been quiet about too many things for too long." Miriam studied him for a moment, then smiled. "Then don't be quiet anymore." The man exhaled, nodding. He looked like he wanted to say something else, but instead he simply said, "Thank you." Then he turned and walked away. Miriam watched him go, then took a slow sip of her coffee. The storm had passed, but the fight for something better would never be over. Justice isn't just about laws. It's about the choices we make when faced with what's right and what's easy. Miriam Caldwell never set out to be a symbol, yet her courage sparked a ripple effect, proving that one voice, one act of defiance can challenge even the most powerful systems. But the fight for accountability doesn't end with one case. It continues in the decisions we make every day. What would you have done in her place? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories that challenge, inspire, and provoke thought, don't forget to subscribe.